This video is an introduction to the AQA Poetry Anthology, which you will be studying in the summer term, brought to you by the English department at Tolworth Girls' School. So like I mentioned, this is just an introduction. I'm going to be talking you through the layout of the exam, what to expect, and most importantly, how you can go about studying the poems in the anthology. So just to give you a sense of the bigger picture, I'm just going to talk you through the outline of the paper. So this is literature paper 2. I'm going to warn you, this is the boring part, but it's really important you understand why you're studying it and how it actually fits in to your final exam. So first things first, the exam is 2 hours and 15 minutes. It is longer than paper 1, and a reminder, in paper 1, you have Romeo and Juliet, which you'll study at the start of year 11, and then you'll have your 19th century novel. So it is longer and it is a closed book examination. So sadly, you don't get to take the anthology of poems in the exam with you. Now, it's worth 60% of your entire literature GCSE. So paper 1 is obviously worth 40%. So this is a really, really important paper. And there are 4 questions on the exam paper. So the first part, obviously, you have already studied and inspect calls, and that's out of 34 marks. Remember, 4 marks is the SPAG. And then question 2 is on the anthology. And again, I will talk you through that in more detail. And questions 3 and 4 are on unseen poems. So you get 2 unseen poems. Question 3 is worth 24 marks and question 4 is worth 8 marks. You don't need to worry about the unseen for now. We will do some unseen poetry this term, but we'll be coming back to it at a later date. There are 15 poems in total. Don't panic. I know that sounds like a lot, but actually when you start breaking them down and start learning them, it shouldn't be daunting. So don't panic. And I mean, I've said just don't panic. This sounds quite scary, but any one of the 15 poems could come up in the exam. And essentially, you then choose another poem to compare that poem to. So I'm going to just show you an example of a question. I don't want to spend too long kind of looking at all of the ins and outs of the exams, but it might be helpful just to show you what the paper looks like and what you can expect from the question. Okay, so here's what the exam looks like. I'm not going to go through all the boring details on the front. Now, if I just show you what you get at the start of the paper, although we studied an inspector calls, obviously not all schools actually study the play. So you just have to find the section. For example, here it tells you where this section is, and inspector calls on page 4, and you've got questions 1 and 2. Let's just have a quick look at that, just to bring back fond memories, I'm sure, of your study of the play, and a reminder you get 2 questions for an inspector calls. Now, when you've done that, you skip all of the other texts, do not answer those. You'd be surprised, some students in the past have actually made that error. Don't ask me why or how. I'm just going to skip right through this, or if it's making you slightly dizzy. Let's go straight to the poetry section. Okay, so there is a cluster called Love and Relationships. We are not studying that cluster, so we're going to go past that question, and this is our cluster. I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment, but this is what it looks like. So you have a question: compare how poets present ideas about power in Ozymandias and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. So you get a copy, as you can see there, of the poem, and you do get your list of the other poems in the anthology, but that is it. I mentioned there that the name of the poetry cluster is Power and Conflict. We use the word cluster. It's just like a group of poems that all link to the themes of power and conflict. So what is in the anthology? Well, I've mentioned 15 poems. These are the poems that you will be studying this term, and you will study them in order. So the next video will be all about Ozymandias, and I'm going to talk you through various things that will essentially set you up for your study of Ozymandias. Now, the first thing we want you to do is just to think about power and conflict, because every single poem you study will directly link to power and conflict. So please pause the video and create a list of all of the different types of power you can think of. So now you've made your list, have a look at mine and just compare and write down anything that you didn't manage to get. Now, as you can see from this list, there are lots of different types of power, and it's really important that when you study the poems, you're not just thinking about power perhaps in the traditional sense. And there are lots of different forms of. Okay, so now let's move on to conflict. So pause the video and create a list of all of the different types of conflict that you can think of. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the 4 main types of conflict, but beyond these 4, there are different and other types of conflict as well, but this is a really good starting point. So the first main conflict is man versus man. So this is essentially someone is having a conflict with someone else, or it could also be a group of people. Then you've got man versus nature, essentially, which might sound a bit strange, but as we study the poems in the anthology, there are a number of poems that do explore this type of conflict. So hopefully that will become clearer as we go through. The next main type of conflict is an internal conflict. So this happens within a person. It could, for example, be a dilemma that they're facing. It could be some sort of emotional struggle. It could be linked to trauma. And then lastly, man versus society. So a conflict an individual has with society, whether that's society as a whole, whether it's to do with the people who are making decisions in society, such as the government. There can be lots of different parts to man versus society. So just to recap, the 4 different types of conflicts. And like I said, when you're looking at the poems, you really need to be thinking about which conflict applies to that particular poem. So we've got man versus man, man versus nature, man versus himself, so internal, inner conflict, and man versus society. So what we want you to do now is just really stop and think about how studying poetry this term will actually be quite different from a novel or a play. So cast your minds back to when you studied A Christmas Carol or Pride and Prejudice, and when you studied An Inspector Call. Although lots of the skills that you have gained will transfer over for the poetry unit, ultimately studying a poem is different from studying a novel or a play. So if you pause the video, and we want you to just make a list of the differences between poetry and prose. So you might like to create a T chart and have on one side poetry and prose, and just kind of list the things that you might be looking for. And remember, you have studied poetry in year 7, 8 and 9. This is not something that is completely new. Okay, so to see how well you did, there is a really great Venn diagram on the website that I've put in the video description. There's a link if you click on that, and it's a really helpful resource so you can compare your notes. But hopefully in doing that, you have realised that there are some key differences. What we're going to move on to now is essentially it's our how-to guide for studying poetry. So this is something, as an English department, we've put together to set you up really for success. So the first thing in terms of steps to success is just to begin with the obvious. So I always suggest starting with the title of a poem. Think about the words or word in the title. What are the connotations of that word? What does it suggest? What meaning can we derive just from the title? Once you've done that, obviously you just need to read the poem. Now, it's really important just to read it once for meaning and then read it twice, just to that second time think about whether you understand what is actually being described in the poem. And don't worry if you don't understand. Sometimes poetry can be confusing, but don't be put off by that. Once you've done that, these are just some questions I would be asking of every poem. And the questions are quite straightforward, like who is speaking in this poem, who is being spoken to, what is the poem trying to make me do or feel, if anything, where does the poem take place, and so on and so forth. You can read through the rest of the questions yourself. And it's not about going through and answering every single question, but this is a really good starting point to prompt your thinking. When you've done that, you are ready to start making annotations. Now, what we're going to provide you with is an overview table, and for each poem you have one quotation for the beginning of the poem, the middle of the poem, or the volta, and the volta is like the turning point, and then one quotation from the end. And the real focus here is quality annotations over quantity. You don't have to annotate every single line of every single poem in your anthology. You won't be able to learn that. That will become overwhelming. And ultimately, it is not an effective use of your time. Of course, if you want to go beyond the 3 quotations that we've selected as a department, you can, but it's just about using your time most effectively. So I'm now going to talk you through how to make quality annotations. So with your quotation, for example, if I chose focus 1 from Ozymandias, which we'll look at in our next video, I would write that in the middle. And I really want to try and say something about the language, about the structure and poetic form, what themes and ideas are being explored, and poet intentions and context. By doing that, I'm covering all of the assessment objectives. So AO1 will link to themes and ideas that will naturally link to power and conflict. AO2, language, structure, form. Remember, level 6, grade 8, grade 9, you have to write about all 3. And then poets, intentions, context will cover AO3. So just to give you a little bit more help in terms of what you might annotate, and I won't read through every single bullet point, but when you're looking at the language, always think about which words in the quotation stand out to me, and then you can ask yourself some of these questions. Same for themes and ideas, slightly more straightforward this one, so just thinking about what themes are present, obviously thinking about power and conflict, and you can return back to your notes on different forms of power and different forms of conflict. And then you've got structure and form. Now, a lot of students do find structure and form harder to write about, but actually when you break it down, it shouldn't be daunting. Hopefully these questions will help you to make some notes on structure and form. And then last but not least, poet intentions and context. Now, you don't need to know the life history of the poet. That's not helpful and it's not relevant. It's more about the context of the poem and the context within the poem. So just thinking about how do we feel in the poem? What are we encouraged to think about? Is the poet perhaps trying to make us realise something? And what are the poet's intentions? What are they attempting to achieve? So just an overview. This is a resource that you can go back to every single time you're annotating and looking at a poem. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. It's now time to pause the video and test yourself. So go through and fill in the gaps, and no kind of cheeky looks back to the start of the video. It's really important you do this from memory. Okay, let's see how you got on. So the first question, exam is 2 hours and 15 minutes. So well done if you got that right. Number 2, it is a closed book examination. You are on your own, I'm afraid. Number 3, it is worth 60% of your literature GCSE. So number 4, breakdown of the whole paper. So section 1 is on an inspector calls. Section 2 is on the anthology, and then 3 and 4 is on unseen. Number 5, there are 15 poems in total. I doubt you forgot that detail. 15 poems, and any one of the 15 poems could come up in the exam. You have to compare the poem that comes up in the exam with one other of your choice. The name of the poetry cluster is Power and Conflicts. When analysing, you consider language, themes and ideas, structure, and poet intentions and context. Doesn't matter on the order of those. And that concludes this video. So I hope it was helpful. Please email your English teachers if you have any questions. And then the next video will be looking at this approach and using the approach for the first poem in the anthology, which is Ozymandias.